Hey, everybody. It is Monday, June 3rd. You're listening to the mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Good morning to everyone from Chicago.
The Windy City. Moshe, what brings you there?
Moderating a couple events here, very excited about, including an event tonight where we're talking all about social media and the news. And it's meant for PR professionals, but really we have a wider audience coming tonight. So if you're nearby River North or willing to make the trek down, hit me up on Instagram and we'll see you here tonight.
Moshe, most importantly, have you figured out where you're going to be eating while you're in Chicago?
I asked for recommendations. I'm here for a very brief period of time, 36 hours. So I'm going to try to get to a couple new places. I'll let folks know where I get to. Thankfully, it's the rare few weeks during the year, Jill, where the weather is not too hot, not too cold, not too rainy in Chicago. There's like 2.5 good months here in the city. Chicago people will kill me, but come on, I grew up here. I know it. Sometimes we get 3 good months. Anyway, we're in that period of time now, so I'm going to max out on that. Jill, one thing I couldn't get enough of this weekend was the spelling bee final, which we didn't get to in Friday's pod because it happened late on Thursday night. But apparently in recent years, they've added something called a lightning round, and it was a remarkable finish.
We're going to talk about it a little bit later in the podcast. But not only couldn't I personally spell any of those words in the lightning round, I don't think I've ever even heard of them. Like, I don't even know what they mean. I couldn't use them in a sentence.
There's one or two I think I've heard before, but literally this 12-year-old who won, Bruhat Soma, from Florida, spelled 29 words in 90 seconds. That's 3 seconds a word. It's incredible. We're going to play the full clip for you at the end of the podcast.
All right, let's get to the headlines here. Donald Trump is vowing revenge and raising record amounts of donations after his criminal conviction last week. We're also getting our first polls on how it is or is not impacting the presidential election.
And Jill hit the streets late last week to talk to voters about how they feel.
All right, what's being called the Forgotten War. We're going to head to Sudan, where the largest humanitarian crisis in the world is unfolding. But why is it getting little to no media coverage? President Biden announces a new ceasefire plan for Israel and Hamas. Are we any closer to an end to fighting this time? And we have updates on 2 major world elections in South Africa and Mexico. The criminal trial for President Biden's son Hunter begins today. What to expect? As housing prices skyrocket, what some states are doing about property taxes. And Florida has opened its registration for its annual Python hunt. And again, the 12-year-old national spelling bee champion has been crowned in a 90-second spell-off. We're going to bring you the dramatic final moments so you can test yourself and see if you can keep up.
Heads up, there's no way you're going to be able to keep up with this kid. Not even close. Maybe 2 words in the time that he did 29.
Plus, Moshe is on this day in history.
We'll look at the Zoot Suit riots, the story behind that, and a little bit of Bob Marley history, as well as that of the very hungry caterpillar on this day in history.
All right, let's begin with the fallout from last week's conviction of former President Trump on criminal felony charges. Trump telling Fox News yesterday that he'll get even with his adversaries by getting his old job back. He said in an interview that, quote, "My revenge will be success." Take a listen.
These are bad people. These people are sick, and they do things that are so destructive. I mean, look what they did from the day I got there. And I don't know, a lot of people said we have no choice but to elect Trump. Republicans, because he's the only one that can withstand this. Don't forget, if it weren't me, they'd be going after somebody else.
Some state Republican attorneys general are vowing to defend Trump and go on offense. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton was quick to come out against Trump's verdict. He's vowing to unleash every tool, quote, at my disposal to fight this blatant corruption and political persecution spewing from New York and the Biden administration. Meanwhile, former President Trump's criminal conviction appears to be spurring a massive donation surge from his supporters. In the 24 hours after Thursday's verdict, the Trump campaign said they raised more than $50 million. A third of that is from first-time donors. And it's also spurring high dollar donors to flock to his side, with his campaign estimating that about $150 million will be raised in the coming days. Several billionaires and big donors are promising to also donate, and that includes Republican mega donor and casino billionaire Miriam Adelson. Politico reports that she plans to help bankroll a massive super PAC for Donald Trump. Adelson is the widow of Las Vegas Sands founder Sheldon Adelson, and she is planning to play a major role in funding Preserve America, a pro-Trump super PAC that she could donate $100 million or more to. She has an estimated net worth of about $33.3 billion and is among several billionaires who have now pledged support.
Yeah, a number of people have come out in recent weeks, including some people, Jill, who said after 2020 that they were done with Trump. But you're hearing from hedge fund billionaire Bill Ackman, Blackstone CEO Steve Schwarzman. Elon Musk apparently has a direct line into Trump these days. There's a major Silicon Valley fundraiser this week hosted by a couple of the guys who host the All In podcast. So it appears the big money and the small money, especially after Thursday, are returning to Trump right now. And it does come as he has been outraised by Biden in the campaign so far. But it looks like, based on the numbers in recent days, that he'll be able to tie him or surpass him. Just based on what we've seen in recent hours, we'll get the final reports at the end of June or end of July for the previous month. Overall, right now, over the last year, both Biden and Trump have each spent about $200 million. Biden had more in the bank going into last week, but that appears to have been changed. But that appears to have changed here. Back to that interview you mentioned on Fox, he was also asked by the Fox News anchors, what of the sentencing on July 11th? Is he worried about going to jail or house arrest? He says he's okay with whatever they give him. At least that's what he told the interviewer. He told his lawyers not to beg for anything, though he did add that he thinks that a house arrest or jail sentence will be, quote, tough for the public to take. You know, at a certain point, he says, there's a breaking point. He didn't exactly go into detail as to what that breaking point is, but again, he's alluding to the public reaction to what could happen. As far as he's concerned, he says it's just the way it is. So we'll see what he says in coming weeks. We'll see what happens July 11th, what the judge determines, what the DA asks for. As far as the public, though, we are starting to get an early sense with an initial polls out this weekend of how Americans feel about it. ABC and CBS were among the media organizations that put polls in the field to get a sense of things. CBS asked the question, how would they feel about jail time? Do Americans feel that Trump deserves jail time for his crimes? 45% say no. 38% say yes, 17% of Americans unsure. When asked if it was a fair trial, 56% of Americans said fair, 44% said unfair, 57% said right verdict. So you have 56% saying it was a fair trial, 57% saying it was the right verdict. Then you get to the party split. 96% of Democrats say he got a fair trial, 56% of independents say he got a fair trial, 14% of Republicans say he got a fair trial. So again, you see 96% of Democrats, 14% of Republicans. You see that party split there. They also asked the question, is he fit to be president? 40% say yes, 51% say no. Notably, that's the same as we've seen before the conviction. The bottom line from ABC and CBS in their polls, when they asked across the board, looking at this nationally, not state by state, is they didn't see much change in opinion. There's no suggestion the verdict has prompted that much in terms of major changes of opinions, though, of course, there could be some changes when you look at people individually or at the margins.
So, Moshe, I hit the mean streets of Long Island on Friday for Newsday to get some reaction to the Trump verdict. And what I found, very anecdotally, it wouldn't be considered a huge sample size. I spoke to about 15 people or so, was that more actually than expected, given some of these early poll numbers that have come out, were impacted by the verdict. I spoke to a few people who said that they were undecided prior. And now, because Trump is a convicted felon, they just don't feel like that's somebody that they can vote for. And they may or may not have been following this trial super closely, but it's the headline that they saw that affected them.
Jill, we should note that you do live in a district that's considered pretty purple, that does swing from Republican to Democrat and back and forth.
Right. And on that note, I also interviewed a political analyst from Hofstra University, Larry Levy, and he said it's too soon to really know, right? It's 6 months until the presidential election. A lot can happen between now and then. There's a big question of how the parties are going to play this. But he said it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't have an impact on the small but persuadable swing voters that are found basically in the suburbs around this country.
Yeah, there's about 50 swing districts, U.S. House districts. Of course, the presidential comes down to about 7 or 8 states there. So, given what we saw in 2020, right, that a state like Georgia came down to 11,000 votes, and it was similar to that in Arizona, et cetera, that these types of things play on the margins, right? If you go back to 2016, the FBI announcement just a couple weeks before the election that Hillary Clinton was being looked into again. Now, they didn't end up finding anything on Anthony Weiner's laptop, but that headline alone, some Clinton people still blame the FBI for pushing enough people over the edge saying, ooh, I don't like that illegality or the idea of illegality, so maybe I'll vote for this new guy Trump back in 2016. And so you have it. So we'll see how the storyline unfolds. Of course, there's a sentencing in July. Then Trump will begin the appeals process. You also have some people who are not Trump fans necessarily, but have said, legally speaking, this was a stretch a little bit, the way that the DA took a misdemeanor that was already past the statute of limitations and sort of revived it into a felony in a type of prosecution that you rarely, if ever, see anywhere in the country. So I've been hearing from some folks over the weekend from the legal space who say, listen, I'm no Trump fan. These are people who are no Trump fan, but say that, it makes them feel a little icky the way that this prosecution went down, even if it was successful. So I think the narrative is yet to be written here. And then the bottom line is, we know what Americans care about, right? They care about education and the economy and immigration and some of these larger issues. And so a late May conviction of Donald Trump over fraudulent documents, how will it impact the vote on November 5th, given we have a lot of history to play out, 2 debates to play out, a whole bunch of stuff that's going to play out? Unclear. And that's just something everyone needs to keep in mind as we sit here now in early June. And then as we talk about the impact of this verdict, we've also been seeing, as we noted in this podcast and saw in some of the polls, there's a percentage of Americans who, because of the conviction, now want to support Trump because they see him as a victim. So it plays both ways. There's certainly a group of people who say, I don't know about someone with 34 felonies. At the same time, there's some people who are like, well, he's being mistreated, so I wasn't ready to support him, but now I will be because, they're treating him unfairly.
All right, Moshe, switching gears. Now let's get to what's being called the Forgotten War. And this is the nearly 14-month civil war in Sudan, fighting between the Sudanese armed forces known as the SAF and the rival Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, a paramilitary group. That fighting is intensifying in a major city of Sudan's northwestern Darfur region. So this broke out last April when the president and the vice president of the country had a falling out over control of armed forces and how to transition to free elections. The president, General Abdel Fattah el-Burhan, controls the SAF, and the former Vice President General, Mohammed Dagalo, controls the RSF, and they are also known as the Janjaweed. You may have heard that term before. These two men, by the way, were once allies and had worked together to take down the previous leader. Then they created this government together, but that did not last very long at all. And now there's this big power struggle going on. Fighting broke out last spring. And since then, the Sudanese civil war has killed tens of thousands of people and displaced about 9 million people. Horrific fighting is destroying the country and making what was a bad humanitarian situation even worse. About 20 million people are now on the brink of famine as aid groups are begging the world to do more. And there is concern of an imminent full-fledged genocide as the RSF, or the Janjaweed, which are the allied Arab militias, commit murder, mass rape, and are just simply massacring the Black tribes in that area.
Yeah, just horrific what's going on down there, Joe. And right now you see both military forces are getting aid from various countries. The Egyptians, the Saudis, and the Iranians are backing the SAF, the president's forces. Meanwhile, you have the United Arab Emirates, which includes Dubai and Abu Dhabi, which is reportedly funneling arms and military supplies to the RSF, the forces of Dagalo, the former vice president. Apparently, the RSF also getting support right now from the country of Chad in Africa, as well as from allies of Putin in Russia. The U.S. right now, which, by the way, sells weapons to a bunch of these countries, so doesn't sell weapons directly to either of these forces in Sudan, but American-made weaponry is ending up there. The U.S. has accused both sides in this civil war of committing war crimes and atrocities, and concluded that the RSF, the vice president's forces, and its allied Arab militias have committed ethnic cleansing. Last week, the U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken had a discussion with President Burhan about the need to end the war here after more than a year, the need to resume peace talks sponsored by the U.S. and the Saudi Arabians taking place in Saudi Arabia. They've stalled for months. They haven't achieved a sustained ceasefire. Both sides, the former VP, the president, saying they're open to talks. Neither side has really followed through here. And it comes as, if you look at a map right now of Sudan, each side controls about half the country right now. The main fighting is in northern Darfur. You may have heard of Darfur decades ago as the place where that genocide happened earlier this century. And that's the concern, is that history is repeating itself again. But this time around, not many people are talking about it. Famine is expected as soon as this month. Some human rights groups are very worried that more than 2 million people could be dead by the end of September. Of those 9 million internally displaced, 2.5 million of them kids under the age of 5. The issue right now when it comes to aid and attention is the world's very distracted, right? The war is getting very little attention because most of the world is focused on Gaza, on Ukraine. Jill, it was notable, PBS NewsHour, one of the few Western media organizations that spend time covering this conflict, had a reporter there, and for the report last week, they were interviewing a guy on the streets of Sudan who recognized this, was like, yeah, no, we see the world. You guys are really into Gaza and Ukraine, but we really need help right now here in Sudan.
And the numbers back that up. Recent data highlights a stark contrast in global news coverage, revealing that Sudan receives 160 times less attention per month than Ukraine or Gaza. Chartbeat, which is an analytics firm, tracked 3,000 media outlets spanning about 70 countries over the past 14 months. And they found that news coverage of Sudan peaked in April of 2023, which was the onset of that war, with approximately 7,000 news articles in the first month. Since the beginning of this year, however, coverage has dwindled, averaging about 600 articles per month. Again, that's 600 articles per month globally. And just compare that to coverage of the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine, which have remained consistently high with about 100,000 to 200,000 stories per month for either conflict. Against Sudan, that's affecting millions more people, averaging just 600 articles per month. The data set also includes 3 other countries, Myanmar, Syria, and Yemen, none of which have managed to consistently amass more than a couple of thousand stories a month. Notably, Myanmar and Syria have struggled to even reach 500 stories a month over the past 2 years. And Moshe, there's a lot of different reasons for that.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons, which I'll get into in a second. But just as you mentioned, Myanmar, Syria, and Yemen, we should note in Yemen, while there has been coverage recently of the Houthi attacks, and so as a background there, the fact that there is a civil war there, we should note that that civil war has been taking place for a decade. 300,000 people are dead, 4 million people internally displaced. Myanmar, there was a military coup that took place there more than 3 years ago. Since then, 50,000 people are killed, 3 million people internally displaced. In Syria, there was coverage of it, more than 10 years ago, and now that civil war started back in 2011. Since then, 500,000 are dead, 14 million people are displaced. Half of those have had to leave the country, half of those displaced in the country. So just a lot of, sadly, this humanitarian situation is going on, but a limited amount of media coverage. Jill, you noted that Sudan getting about 600 stories a month versus 100 to 200,000 for those other conflicts. If you actually remove 1 or 2 media sources in Europe that cover Africa, and you just focus on U.S. potential coverage of it, you might be down to a couple dozen stories a month compared to the tens of thousands that you've seen in the U.S. for those other conflicts. So how does media coverage get decided here? There's a lot of factors. And as I thought about it during my time at Fox and CBS, here's the list of what I've come up with. As you decide what you're covering abroad, you think about a few things. How remote is the place? How expensive is it to get to? How difficult is it to get to? One thing to keep in mind is that outside of DC and New York, the most amount of journalists per capita in the world is in Israel. A lot of journalists from around the world are based there for a variety of reasons. Israel happens to be a democracy in that part of the world, so it's very easy to station journalists there. You know that they have it easy in, easy out, and they can cover from there. Most organizations are covering the entirety of the Middle East and Africa. from that vantage point. So with the journalists who are there, well, they're going to cover what's in the neighborhood because they live there. So that ends up biasing journalists to have more coverage, right? Then also factoring into your decisions as you're deciding what to cover around the world, how much attention is the conflict getting from non-governmental organizations, from human rights organizations, from the UN, from Western governments, from celebrities, from politicians. All of that factors in there. If they're talking about it a lot, you tend to then focus on it as a media organization. On top of that, it's not just the more powerful people, it's the regular folks out there. Is social media talking about it? Are things trending on social media? If we see stuff trending on social media, that gets coverage. Then there's overall demand from the public beyond social media. Are you writing letters in? Are you calling? Are you holding protests outside of media organizations to cover a certain topic? Then another factor, the expat population or the influence of that country's expat population around the world are interested groups. The Israelis and the Palestinians, the Ukrainians, all have either large populations or influential groups around the world that get the media's attention to things happening there. And then there's just resources, which is, okay, we're going to cover a couple things. How many things can we cover? We're covering the Israel-Palestinian conflict. We're covering the Ukraine-Russia conflict. That's expensive. That requires resources. And by the way, the average American viewer, while they say they care about foreign news, the ratings say otherwise, Jill, as I discovered through years there. And so they're not going to spend the entirety of the newscast covering foreign issues. So you sort of pick one or two, Jill, it's the discussions we have even on the mo.news feed is like, okay, how many things can we get to today? We've covered some stuff abroad. Let's cover some stuff at home. And even this story, we wanted to do this last week on the podcast feed. And then, of course, the criminal conviction happened. So we're doing it today.
Well, that's right, Moshe. On Friday, we literally started the podcast with a story that we had titled The Forgotten War. Why is nobody covering Sudan? And then we had to cancel that story and push it to today. It's not even funny, but it's just that unfortunately is the way that news works. And the other thing that I'll mention in terms of resources really quickly is that the world in terms of bureaus, foreign bureaus, didn't always look like it does now. And I remember when I first started out in this business 20 plus years ago, I was working for a network that had numerous bureaus across the world. And that network, like almost every other one, has completely cut back and now has basically very few foreign bureaus, which is why if you watch news coverage, you'll notice that there is a story that name a city in the world or a country in the world. Something could be happening in Southeast Asia, and the reporter who's covering it is in London. And you're kind of like, why is the person in London talking about, what's happening, a tsunami in Banda Aceh? And it is because of resources and networks that have had to cut back big time in order to try and turn a profit.
Yeah, that move towards profitability in news happened in the 80s. And Jill, that was a time too during the Cold War when, I remember talking to some of the old timers at CBS who were like, we used to have a Rome bureau and a Berlin bureau and a Moscow bureau and a Paris bureau and, and Johannesburg, and we could just go anywhere in the world. And now most Western organizations, most U.S. organizations, you have a London office, you have an office in Israel, and then you have an office in either China or Japan. And that's how you cover the world. And you cover South America from Miami. And you have to check with budgets every time to see how much we've spent on something. And literally, we might not cover a certain story because we blew the budget on a previous story. And so, you end up hiring a local person and getting someone to shoot some video for you, and you call it a day. And that's one of the challenges. And in particular, Africa, sadly, has suffered from this fate, even going back to the era of 40 years ago when they had bigger budgets. It still wasn't getting the coverage that it deserves.
Time now for the speed read from Reuters. 3 days after President Biden laid out what he called an Israeli proposal to end its war on Hamas, it is clear that key aspects of the deal have not, in fact, been embraced by parts of the Israeli government. As the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza approaches its 8th month, the impasse between the two sides over exchanging hostages for prisoners remains unchanged. So Israel would pause fighting, but not end it completely as long as Hamas continues to be in charge of Gaza. Meanwhile, Hamas will only free Israeli hostages if it is guaranteed a permanent ceasefire. And the terror group has a future running the Gaza Strip, as it has for the last 17 years. At the White House on Friday, Biden laid out that 3-phase plan that he said was Israel's, a 6-week truce involving hostage prisoner exchanges and increased aid, followed by a focus on a permanent ceasefire and the removal of Israeli forces from Gaza, and finally, major reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. An outline of that same plan has been approved by Israel and Hamas at various points in the last few months, but some of the hard details are still at issue. Hamas said that it welcomed any proposal, quote, based on a permanent ceasefire, as well as a total Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Israeli officials say that the plan that they have agreed to does not include a permanent ceasefire. Netanyahu issued 2 statements over the weekend. He said, quote, Israel's conditions for ending the war have not changed. The destruction of Hamas's military and governing capabilities, the freeing of all hostages and ensuring that Gaza no longer poses a threat. The idea that Israel would agree to a permanent ceasefire before those conditions are fulfilled is a non-starter.
So this is your typical conflict resolution negotiation. Who goes first? We all agree generally on principles, but who does what first and how? Who says what publicly versus privately? How do you sell it abroad? How do you sell it to your own constituents? And how does each side get to claim success and a win? That is ultimately how conflict resolution happens here. Now, what's interesting here is Biden makes the speech on Friday afternoon. It was past sunset in Israel. The Sabbath had begun. So a strategic speech here from Biden, who effectively takes a proposal in general terms that the Israelis had put forth, that Hamas had agreed to in portion, and announces it as a plan. Effectively trying to put pressure on both sides, saying, I'm going to put this out there in the public, because remember what happened last time was there was a proposal. It went to the Qataris and the Egyptians to Hamas. Hamas then declared they agreed to a ceasefire. That was a different plan than what the Israelis had agreed to. So Biden's trying to nip this in the bud this time. Now, as far as the Israeli reaction here, the White House believes that Netanyahu is saying certain things for domestic purposes. Remember, he has a coalition government that includes people who support this, that includes some people on the right wing who don't support this, who believe that this war must continue until Hamas is completely destroyed. At the same time, a top foreign policy advisor to Netanyahu was quoted over the weekend saying that the Biden proposal is a deal we agreed to. It's not a good deal, but we want the hostages released, so we're going to go ahead with it, even though a lot of details here need to be worked out. And as we know, the agreement is all in details, who goes first, etc., and how it's characterized internally to the coalition. A reminder here, that's the Israeli side. On the Hamas side, they're in no hurry. They feel like they've survived the war here. They have no plans to return a hostage unless the war ends completely, unless Israel is out. They don't feel like they're getting that much pressure put on them at this point, that they're on to live another day, to be in charge of Gaza's government moving forward. And that presents a conundrum here for the Israeli government, some of whom said early on this is about depleting Hamas's capabilities. Others, including the prime minister, who've said this is about completely obliterating them so they never lead another day. The way Biden characterized it on Friday, they can't do another October 7th. For some Israelis, that's fine. For some Israelis, that's not enough. Hamas needs to go. They cannot control Gaza on their border moving forward after what took place in the fall. There are people internally in Israel who said, listen, the war is 8 months old. 36,000 people have died in Gaza. We haven't been able to capture the top Hamas leaders. For the most part, we have not been able to get out any hostages unless it's in a deal, except for saving a couple of them. So there's no point in keeping this ongoing war going. Let's reset here. And so you see an internal debate happening in Israel. Hamas is chilling right now, waiting to see what goes down. The Biden speech was intended at a certain domestic audience in Israel, and then, of course, a push to the international community to push both sides to strike a deal.
It was definitely interesting politics on the part of Biden, as you mentioned, to put that out on a Friday night, basically the start of Shabbat. And then former President Obama, he came out with a piece endorsing that same deal. So a lot of pressure here on Benjamin Netanyahu. And Moshe, I saw that you had posted, and I read it as well, that article in The Atlantic by Yair Rosenberg, which has some great context on this if you're curious just kind of about the back and forths and how this all went down. So we shall see what happens. We've been here before where it feels like we're close to some type of deal that would end the fighting. And it hasn't, but perhaps this time will be different.
Yeah, notably, again, this is the outline both sides have agreed to in recent months, now brought to you by Joe Biden. Will this order of events actually help them strike a deal here? Too soon to tell.
All right, from ABC News, the president's son, Hunter Biden, set to stand trial on felony gun charges in a historic case that could impact his dad's reelection campaign. It is the first time in American history that the child of the sitting president is going on trial. The indictment was brought by the Justice Department, the special counsel appointed last year to oversee the Hunter Biden probes. Hunter Biden is 54 years old. He is accused of illegally purchasing and possessing a gun while abusing or being addicted to drugs. That is a violation of federal law. He pleaded not guilty to the 3 charges, although he has been open about his struggles with alcohol and crack cocaine addiction. So when a person buys a gun, they need to fill out a form with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives and affirm that they are legally allowed to buy the weapon. Hunter Biden has been charged with lying on those forms because you're asked, are you an unlawful user of or addicted to illegal drugs? Hunter Biden allegedly checked the box that said no. He later got himself in trouble when he admitted in his autobiography that he was on drugs during that purchase. So that basically incriminates himself there. It's also against federal law to possess a gun if you are abusing drugs. Hunter Biden had the gun for just 11 days in October of 2018 before his then girlfriend threw it in a dumpster because she was worried about his mental health.
Yeah, we should know that these types of cases are not typically prosecuted unless the weapon is used in a crime. The weapon here was not used in a crime. And as you noted, Jill, he effectively is on trial here partially because he wrote in the book that he was on drugs. He effectively gave the prosecution its case here. Now, right now, prosecutors say they plan to call about a dozen witnesses for their case. Most notably, they've lined up 3 of Hunter Biden's former romantic partners to testify about his drug use around the time he bought the gun. That includes his ex-wife, Kathleen Buell, former girlfriend and late brother's widow, Hallie Biden. Remember, Hunter Biden dated his brother's wife after his brother died, and then London Roberts, the mother of one of his children. So 3 of his former romantic partners will testify here. Their testimony will bring to life a period where Hunter was described at rock bottom, always on drugs or trying to get drugs. Now, Hunter says that he's been sober since May of 2019. His lawyer said they might call up an expert who can tell the jury about how people with addictions understand their own struggles. This case was initiated by a former Trump-appointed U.S. attorney that the Biden administration kept on. The Attorney General, Merrick Garland, elevated David Weiss, that's his name, the U.S. attorney, to special counsel status after a proposed plea deal last year. We told you about it. It blew up in spectacular fashion. Hunter Biden's lawyers are upset. They thought they had a deal there, but then that deal came under a lot of criticism from Republican lawmakers, former President Trump. So effectively, they decided to go ahead and indict here. Now, note, Jill, and the Biden administration will make a point of this, the special counsel here reports to the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland reports to the president. So Dem officials note this showcases, as far as they're concerned, how independent the Justice Department is, even under President Biden, that they are technically prosecuting here the president's son. Now, if Hunter is convicted here in this trial, he could face up to 25 years in prison. However, he does not have a prior criminal record. He would be a first-time offender. They often get much lower sentences from the maximum. And again, these types of cases are rarely prosecuted, especially if the gun was not used in a crime, but it is high profile. His last name is Biden. So we will see. That'll be another sentence, if he's guilty, up to a judge later this year.
Now from The Economist, South Africa is seeing the biggest shakeup in its politics in the 30 years since the end of apartheid. The African National Congress, or the ANC, which has governed since 1994, has been rejected by almost 60% of voters. Given the ANC's record of corruption, rotten governance, economic stagnation, and rising unemployment, the highest in the developed world at 32%, The country should be celebrating. Instead, it is anxiously awaiting the results of backroom negotiations that will determine what path South Africa takes. Since it will be unable to form a government on its own to stay in power, the ANC will have to enter a coalition with a big opposition party. The ANC, which once commanded the support of almost 70% of the electorate, has been in shock since voting took place last week. It looks like it got about 40% of the vote. A couple of options for the ANC. One is to do a deal with the Economic Freedom Fighters Party. That is a radical socialist and anti-white party that wants to seize and redistribute farmland and nationalize mines and banks. And then another possible coalition partner is the MK. That is a new party led by former President Jacob Zuma, who served prison time for corruption. He wants to abolish the existing judicial system that sent him to prison, nationalize banks and businesses, and rewrite the Constitution.
Yeah, so a lot of potential radical solutions there. You might remember the ANC. That was Nelson Mandela's party and has effectively run the country since the end of apartheid. But there are a lot of concerns in South Africa that things are heading down a bad path. And there are concerns here that depending on the coalition that the ANC chooses here, that things could get worse. Now, it does appear that the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, will stay in power, but he's going to have to figure out his coalition partners. You mentioned two of them, Jill. Another party he could ally with is the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance. They have a proven record, according to The Economist, of governing well in places where they have a majority. In Cape Town, that's where services largely work. Roads are maintained. Residents don't suffer from the worst power cuts. Right now in South Africa, the power just goes across the country. People have come to expect it. The issue he has, if he tries to get with that third party, the Democratic Alliance, is they're perceived as the white party in a country with a black majority. So they have struggled to translate that. Everything is seen through a racial lens there, given the history of South Africa. And so this is going to be a story we keep tracking. And we have an update now from just south of the border where Mexicans went to the polls on Sunday, and it appears they have elected Claudia Sheinbaum to be the next leader of the country. She will be the first female president of Mexico. It appears she won in a landslide. As of early Monday morning, exit polls showed her getting between 58 to 63% of the vote. She has a huge challenge ahead of her. She replaces outgoing President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, known as AMLO, extremely popular, probably the most popular leader in all of Latin America with a 60% plus approval rating. Now, he was term limited out of running again. Mexico has a one-term, 6-year term. Sheinbaum is seen as his protege, but she is inheriting a lot of work. There's rampant criminal violence. The cartel violence in particular in Mexico has increased over the last few years. And there's also a very large fiscal deficit that has been left behind by his government. Mexico is Latin America's second biggest economy. By the way, they're also the number one trading partner for the U.S. So their economy, key to our economy. And AMLO, during his term, went on a spending spree. It is one of the reasons why he's become so popular, but effectively writing out welfare checks, tripling the minimum wage. It made him a hero to the working poor in the country, but has left the country now with its largest deficit in more than 40 years. At the same time, he pursued a new policy with drug cartels in Mexico, what he called hugs, not bullets. He was really trying to get to the root causes of the violence, but what it has meant is that the drug cartels have expanded their influence across Mexico. And it was a key issue in this election, but it appears that Sheinbaum dominated here. Her competitor, Xochitl Galvez, represented a coalition of opposition parties that had ruled the country for nearly 90 years until AMLO came into power. It appears, though, that the country does not want them back. She only got between 27 and 30% of the vote, according to exit polls. Sheinbaum is a climate scientist turned politician. She was the mayor of Mexico City and is now, it appears, as of early Monday morning, the next president of Mexico.
From the Associated Press, a look at the state of property taxes for U.S. homeowners. Over the past 5 years, single-family home prices have risen about 54% nationally. That means higher tax bills for homeowners if governments don't offset higher real estate values by reducing tax rates. With that in mind, states like Colorado, Alabama, and Wyoming have passed new laws that will limit the growth in tax-assessed values for homeowners. Property tax relief will be part of a special legislative session starting June 18th in Kansas, while Nebraska also could hold a special session to cut property taxes. Georgia voters will decide in November whether to authorize a new law limiting increases in assessed home values for tax purposes to the rate of inflation.
So a reminder here that in many states, property taxes are primarily a function of local governments, like counties, cities, school boards, special districts. They're determining the property tax rates. Each entity does. And that effectively determines the overall tax bill for property owners. Now, state legislatures can intervene in a variety of ways at the state level. They can establish statewide limits on how much assessed property values can rise, create partial tax exemptions for all homeowners, or provide income tax credits that help offset the property taxes for certain groups of people, like people 65 and older and other groups. But the issue a lot of states are facing here is that relief carries consequences, that if you limit property taxes, that then shifts the tax burden, right? Because if you're not taxing people as much on their primary residences, rental properties and businesses now have to pay a higher burden because those property taxes go to fund everything in the community. So Colorado right now has been at the center of a property tax debate. The state has been experiencing a decades-long growth in new residents, a huge population boom in Colorado that has driven up the demand for housing. Meanwhile, it has been struggling to find a balance between providing tax relief for homeowners and sufficient funding for local government. So as we've discussed extensively, real estate here, you see property taxes really coming into focus.
From the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, registration is currently underway for the 2024 Florida Python Challenge. It's an annual hunt that takes place in August to rid the Everglades of an invasive predator of native species in Florida. Registering for the Burmese python hunt will give you the opportunity to win a share of more than $25,000 in prizes. Hunters from as far away as Belgium and 35 different states rush to Florida for this challenge. Authorities say as many as 1,050 people come to the Sunshine State to hunt pythons during this event.
Yeah, so Jill, last year at the challenge, 209 Burmese pythons were removed from the Everglades, which, okay, that's a couple hundred, but it doesn't really put a dent in the overall population. Jill estimated, it's very hard for them to estimate, but they think it's in the hundreds of thousands. It could be in the millions at this point. Pythons became a very popular exotic pet about 50 years ago in the 1970s, but then some of these pythons, people realized, grew so large that they then released them into the wild. And so we talk decades later, and multiple generations of pythons now have taken over parts of the Everglades. They're killing the natural species there. And so they're trying to come up with ways to get rid of them. And I guess among them is this hunt that takes place every August. But again, just a couple hundred out of the hundreds of thousands in the Everglades.
And finally, from the Tampa Tribune, Florida seventh grader Bruhat Soma won the National Spelling Bee and the $50,000 prize in Maryland Thursday with an impressive display in the final round. The 12-year-old spelled 29 words in just 90 seconds compared to his opponent's 20 words in that same time frame. So, Moshe, let's just play a bit of this because it's amazing.
Bruette.
Brouette.
Adelantado.
Adelantado.
Hypercheme.
Hyporchgme.
Bicelium.
Biscellum.
Mycteric.
Mycterc.
Endacha.
Endecha.
Saracen.
Sercin.
Nyctalopia.
Nyctalopiae.
Ascum.
Aschm.
Wenzel.
Wenzel.
Cebel.
Cebell.
Heautophany.
Heautopany.
Quazoku.
Kdozoku.
Panetiere.
Panetiere.
Sagai.
Sagai.
Nachschlager.
Nachschlage.
Exorison.
Exorison.
Porphyrio.
Or Porphyrio.
Giclée.
Gicle.
Ashwagandha.
Ashwagandha.
Again, he spells 29 words in 90 seconds. Organizers had called for a spell-off lightning round to determine a winner in the interest of time, following 14 rounds over 3 days at the national championships.
So, Jill, I remember watching this, and I feel like the lightning round is a new thing because, like, always the spelling bee was like they get up and they ask for like the origin language. They ask the judge to use it in a sentence, and it just goes on. And so I guess they've instituted into these lightning rounds, and the kids are prepared these days. Soma says that he prepared by practicing spell-offs every day for 6 months. He had a spelling coach, this guy Sam Adams. I should say guy, he's a kid. He's 16 himself, his spelling coach. Sam Evans actually worked with 3 of the 4 top finishers as the spelling coach. And so every day with Soma, they would, for every 1 hour practice session, they would do 3 spell-offs. Soma's preparation here is incredible. He said he would prepare 10 hours a day on weekends, 6 hours a day on weekdays to get ready for this. And of course, his dedication paid off with the winnings, and he wins $50,000, which he says, Jill, listen to this, he's giving it away to charity. He said in one interview, I'm going to donate it to underprivileged people because not everyone has access to basic stuff like education and food and basic needs for survival. So not only is he a spelling champion, he's a philanthropist, Jill.
Mensch, Moshe, MENSCH.
Language of origin, Yiddish.
Yiddish.
All right, let's end here with On This Day in History on this June 3rd. We begin in 1937. Those of you who are familiar with royal history will know that Prince Edward, Duke of Windsor, married American socialite Wallis Simpson on this day. Of course, she was an American divorcee, which meant he had to leave the line of succession. All right, on this day in 1943, Jill, I didn't know about this. I just remember the song Zoot Suit Riot, but on this day, but that phrase has a very serious history. On this day, in June 1943, LA erupted with its worst race riots. 10 straight nights, American sailors using makeshift weapons cruised Mexican-American neighborhoods in search of zoot suiters, which were young Mexican teens dressed in baggy pants and long-tailed coats. It led to just open fighting in the community. Again, these sailors going and beating some members of the community. The background here was that America needed workers during World War II with all of the soldiers who went off to the war front. And so they brought in workers from Mexico who were not given equal rights. A murder happens within the community. And during that period, the news media started to portray the Mexicans, these zoot suiters who were wearing these outfits, as dangerous gang members who were capable of murder. So on the basis of news reports, more and more people began to believe that these youths were predisposed to committing crimes, leading to mass arrests, high tensions, and then the Zoot Suit riots of 1943. All right, a bit of space history on this day. Ed White becomes the first American astronaut to walk in space on this day, on Gemini 4. In children's literary history, we all have a copy of this if we have kids. Very Hungry Caterpillar was first published on this day in 1969.
Moral of the story, Moshe, if you're going to eat an apple, 2 pears, 3 plums, 4 strawberries, 5 oranges, 1 piece of chocolate cake, an ice cream cone, a pickle, a slice of Swiss cheese, salami, a lollipop, and a piece of cherry pie.
Yes.
And then some, you're going to get a bellyache. It's not going to go well.
It's an important lesson to teach every child.
It doesn't work out well.
All right, we end here with music history. On this day, 57 years ago, 1967, the Doors released their hit, Light My Fire. They would perform the song on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they were asked, Jill, as they went on the show, to change the lyric, Girl, we couldn't get much higher, because of the drug reference to it. Jim Morrison and the group were like, yeah, sure, we'll agree to that. Well, they didn't actually change the lyric, and they would be banned after the show from future appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was the biggest show in America at that point.
I feel like they probably have no regrets about that.
Oh, why?
Things have worked out.
Yeah, no, but it shows you where we were. But it shows you where we were at that stage where they had to change the lyric. Girl, we couldn't get much higher. And one more piece of music news here. Don't worry about a thing, 'cause everything's gonna be all right. Turning 47 years old today, on this day in 1977, Bob Marley and the Wailers released their masterpiece, Exodus album. Jill, it combined blues, soul, funk, rock. It gives you 3 Little Birds, it gives you jamming, and it gives you One Love.
Moshe, and Jamaica tourism has never been the same. Neither have I. I love that album, and I love Bob Marley.
Anywhere you go in the world, Jill, I mean, I remember traveling years ago, and it's like you either saw a Michael Jordan jersey or a Bob Marley t-shirt, no matter how remote you were in the world. And I remember going around, I mean, as I sit here recording this from Chicago, where people are like, oh, Chicago, Al Capone, Michael Jordan. And so I think it was the same thing with Jamaica, Bob Marley.
Speaking of children's books, there's actually a great children's book series based on a lot of his songs that I highly recommend. Big favorites in my house. They're called like Every Little Thing or One Love. They're based exactly on the lyrics, but they're just great. And you can sing as you read. But we got to wrap because this show has gone on, I think, a little bit longer than usual. Thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
See you guys tomorrow.